The year was 1879. The high desert of the New Mexico Territory did not measure time in days, but in degrees of heat. Redwater Crossing existed only because the river bled slow and shallow enough to be forded, leaving a smear of damp, alkali sand that clung to everything. It was a town of raw lumber and wishful thinking, baked brown by a sun that took no prisoners. Above the saloon, the brothel, and the mercantile, the only sound that tried to fight the wind was the church bell. It was a thin, tired sound, ringing out the noon hour with a weak, metallic plea that the wind tore apart and scattered over the sagebrush. Dust coated the street, thick and fine as flour. It rose in lazy plumes under the boots of the few citizens who dared cross the open ground between buildings. It was this dust that rose to meet Cassia Wynne when she fell. She did not fall cleanly. It was a collapse, a slow surrender of the knees that had been trembling for the last mile. She had been aiming for the church, drawn by that thin bell, believing sanctuary lay within the shadow of its cross. Her vision had narrowed to a pinprick of light, the adobe walls of the church swimming in and out of focus. Her dress, once a respectable blue, was stiff with grime and sweat. Her hair, the color of dried corn silk, was matted to her scalp. She landed hard on the packed earth of the churchyard. A small cry, more air than sound, escaping her. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, the black alkali dust instantly clinging to the moisture. For a moment, she lay still, the only movement the desperate, shallow flutter of her pulse visible in her throat. Her eyes wide and unnoticed, tried to fix on the steeple. She was burning from the inside out. The fever had hold, and it was shaking her apart. The bell stopped ringing, leaving a sudden, heavy silence. From the shade of the church doorway, two men emerged. The first was the Reverend Abner Pike, a man built of sharp angles and black wool, whose piety was as unforgiving as the landscape. He held a leather-bound Bible against his chest as if it were a shield. The second was Hiram Keats, the town's apothecary and self-proclaimed physician. He was Pike's opposite, short, soft, and smelling perpetually of camphor and stale whiskey. He carried a black leather bag that he was constantly wiping with a damp handkerchief. They stopped 10 feet from the woman, the small congregation a handful of miners' wives. The blacksmith and 2 merchants had begun to gather. Drawn by the sudden halt of the bell, they formed a loose, wary half-circle. Keats took a nervous step forward, squinted, and then retreated. "That's the Wynne girl. Isn't it the one staying at the boarding house?" Reverend Pike did not look at Keats. His eyes were fixed on Cassia, his face impassive. "She is disturbing the sanctity of the Lord's house. She looks sick." "Reverend?" Keats whispered, his voice oily with concern that did not reach his eyes. "Very sick. A sudden fever, like this. It's a bad omen." Pike nodded slowly. The 2 men shared a look, a quick, silent understanding that was equal parts calculation and dismissal. This was not a soul to be saved. This was a problem to be moved. "It is God's will that we protect the flock," Pike declared, his voice rising to carry to the small crowd. He looked at the blacksmith. "Thaddeus Crow. Mr. Crow, remove this disturbance. Take her to the alley behind the mercantile. She is a vagrant, and vagrancy brings pestilence." Thaddeus Crow, a mountain of a man with soot in the lines of his face, shifted his weight. He looked at the girl, then at the Reverend. He did not like the order, but Pike was the law of God in Redwater Crossing, and Keats was the law of medicine. Before Crow could move, another sound joined the scene, the steady, unhurried plod of a single horse coming up the street. The rider was Hale Mercer. He was 35 years old, though the sun and the solitude of his ranch, juniper wash, had carved deeper lines into his face. He was a man defined by his isolation, riding into town only when supplies or debts demanded it. He was lean, dressed in brown canvas pants and a worn linen shirt. The dust of his own land settled on his shoulders. He wore no sidearm, but a Winchester rifle was nestled in the scabbard by his saddle. He rode a rangy gray gelding, Ashbolt, who seemed as weary of the town as his rider. Hale pulled the horse to a halt near the churchyard, his eyes taking in the scene, the silent crowd. Pike and Keats standing in judgment, and the small, still form on the ground. He dismounted, the squeak of his saddle leather loud in the hush. He moved to his horse's side, his back to the crowd, and drew the Winchester from its sheath. The crowd tensed. Hale Mercer did not turn. He walked to the adobe steps of the church and deliberately, slowly, laid the long rifle down on the cool tile. The metallic click was a punctuation mark. He had come to settle his tithe of wheat with the Reverend, and he would not enter the house of God armed. Only then did he turn to face the assembly. He looked past Pike, past Keats, his gaze landing on Cassia. He saw the unnatural stillness, the tremor that shook her even as she lay prone. "What is this? Reverend?" Hale's voice was low, rough from disuse, but it carried, "Mr. Mercer," Pike said, assuming his tallest, most authoritative stance. "This is a church matter. A woman of ill repute has collapsed. Dr. Keats suspects a dangerous sickness. She's burning up," Keats added quickly. "It could be scarlet fever, or the cholera. We cannot risk the town for one." Hale ignored Keats. He walked past the two men, the crowd parting for him as if he were a different kind of authority. He stopped beside Cassia and knelt on one knee. He brushed the dusty hair from her face. The heat that rolled off her skin was shocking, a dry, baking intensity that spoke of a desperate fight within. Her lips moved, forming a soundless word. "She needs water and shade," Hale said, his voice flat. "She needs quarantine," Keats insisted, stepping forward. "As the town's medical authority, I forbid you to touch her. You'll spread the contagion." Hale looked at the apothecary. His eyes, the color of worn denim, were cold. "You haven't been close enough to her to diagnose a sunburn. Keats, you just want her out of sight." "This is defiance. Mercer." Pike's voice cracked like a whip. "This is God's will. She is unclean." Hale gently slid one arm beneath Cassia's shoulders and the other under her knees. She weighed almost nothing. As he stood, her head lolled back, and her burning forehead came to rest against the skin of his neck, just below his jaw. He flinched, not from the heat, but from the fragile contact. Her breathing was a series of short, ragged gasps. The crowd murmured, "Don't get involved. Hale, it's the fever. Listen to the Reverend." Hale held the dying woman against his chest and looked Abner Pike square in the eye. The rancher was not a tall man, but he seemed to cast the only shadow in the yard. "This is God's house, Reverend," Hale Mercer said, his voice quiet, yet cutting through the heat. "Not a place to abandon the dying." Pike's face went white with fury. His hand tightened on his Bible until his knuckles showed. Keats looked terrified, his gaze flicking between the rancher and the Reverend. Hale did not wait for a reply. He turned his back on them all. He walked steadily toward his horse. Cassia held securely. With one hand, he unbuttoned the long canvas duster tied behind his saddle. He shook it out a cloud of juniper-washed dust exploding in the sun and deftly, tenderly, wrapped it around her, cocooning her small, trembling body. He ignored the protests from Keats in the cold, venomous stare from Pike. He put his boot in the stirrup and swung up onto Ashbolt, settling Cassia against his chest, her head tucked under his chin. He turned the gray horse away from the church, away from the silent judgment of the town. He kicked the horse into a steady walk, leaving Redwater Crossing behind. As he cleared the last building, the only sound that followed him was the faint, biting wind and the cold, measured stare of Reverend Pike and Hiram Keats, watching him carry the bad omen toward the empty, protective solitude of Juniper Wash. Juniper Wash was not a place of comfort. It was a place of survival, carved into a high plateau where the wind never stopped speaking. Hale's ranch consisted of a one-room cabin built of solid pine logs, chinked with mud and straw, a sturdy barn for his horses, and a stone-lined trough fed by a groaning, creaking windmill. The windmill was the ranch's heartbeat, its metal blades turning a slow, rhythmic complaint against the sky. The air smelled of dry dust, pine resin, and the sharp, clean scent of the juniper trees that gave the place its name. Hale carried her inside. The cabin was sparse, containing only what was necessary: a cast-iron stove, a dry sink, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, and in the far corner, his own cot. A rifle rack near the door held a spare shotgun. The place was clean, the floor swept, the blankets on the cot folded. It was the space of a man who lived by routine, and she was an interruption of the most profound kind. He laid her on the cot, the canvas duster still wrapped around her. She whimpered at the movement, her body curling instinctively. He stood over her for a long moment, the sheer fragility of her rattling him. He was used to sickness in livestock, a horse with colic, a cow with shipping fever. This was different. This was a human being, and she was burning up in his bed. He moved with a sudden, rough efficiency. He stoked the stove, not for heat, but to boil water. He went to his dry goods box and pulled out a handful of dried sage leaves and a small tin of powdered willow bark he kept for aches and fevers. He returned to her side and began the work. First, he unbuttoned the high collar of her filthy dress. As he did, he saw the faint, dark purple marks on her neck, just below the jawline. But his focus was on the fever. He needed to get her clean, to get the heat down. He poured water from the cistern into a basin and found a clean rag. He unlaced her boots, caked with alkali mud, and pulled them off, revealing stockinged feet that were terribly small. He worked systematically, his large, calloused hands surprisingly gentle. He bathed her face, her neck, her arms. The water turned gray in the basin. When he refilled it, he dipped the rag in the cool water and laid it across her forehead. It seemed to sizzle on contact. She moaned, a long, low sound of misery, and tried to push it away. "Easy," he grunted, his voice sounding foreign in his own cabin. "Easy. Now, it'll help." He forced himself to be patient. He brewed the sage into a bitter tea and mixed a gritty paste of the willow bark powder with a little water. He propped her head up. Her eyes were closed, her lashes dark against the flushed, translucent skin of her cheeks. "You have to drink," he ordered, though his voice was low. He dipped a spoon into the willow bark paste and touched it to her cracked lips. She clamped her mouth shut. He persisted, nudging the spoon against her teeth until her lips parted in a gasp. He slid the paste inside, and she coughed, a dry, weak hack, but she swallowed. He followed it with a spoonful of the hot, bitter sage tea. She swallowed that, too. For hours. This was the rhythm of the cabin. The wind rose outside, whistling under the door. The windmill groaned. Inside, there was the sound of water splashing softly into the basin, the clink of the spoon against the cup, and the terrible, rapid whisper of her breathing. He made a thin broth from a piece of dried chicken, skimming the fat, trying to get nourishment into her. She swallowed a few spoons before turning her head, her body rigid with a sudden tremor. She began to talk. The words were disjointed, ripped from her by the fever. They were whispers and choked cries. "No, the iron wheels. Elijah. Father, don't sign it." Hale stopped, the spoon halfway to the bowl. He listened. "The wagon. It's scraping the stone." Her hands clenched the blanket. "It's not right, Father. It's not." And then the words that meant nothing to him, yet held a strange, desperate weight. "Silver Ridge. He can't have it. Elijah wins. Silver Ridge." She quieted, falling back into the deep, troubled ocean of the fever. Hale stood watching her. Elijah Wynne, Silver Ridge. The names echoed in the small, warm room. He continued his work. He was changing the cloth on her forehead, his fingers brushing the damp, matted hair from her face, when he felt it, down at her ankle. The hem of her dress was stiff and unnaturally thick. It was not just mud. There was something inside, sewn into the fabric. His curiosity, usually a dormant thing, was piqued. He felt the fabric between his thumb and forefinger. It was a small, flat packet. Finding a loose thread, he pulled. The seam gave way, and he carefully worked his fingers into the hem. He drew out a small pouch made of oilcloth, folded tightly. It was warm from her body. He unfolded it on the table under the light of his coal oil lamp. Inside were 2 items. The first was a piece of heavy paper, folded into a small square. He opened it carefully. It was not a full map, but a fragment, a surveyor's sketch of a series of claims, marked with angles and measurements drawn in neat, professional ink. In the corner, a name, E. Wynne. The second item was a cluster of 3 small, heavy, lead-gray rectangles. They were assay tags, the kind a miner gets back from the assayer's office, stamped with numbers and symbols that declared the value of an ore sample. Hale had seen them before. These tags indicated a strike of astonishing richness. Silver. He looked from the map to the tags, then back to the girl on his cot. This was not a simple vagrant. This was not just a fever. This was a secret, and a heavy one. He looked at her again, his gaze sharper now, searching. He saw what he had missed in his hurry. Her left wrist, lying palm up on the blanket, was a canvas of dark, ugly bruises. They were not the scattered marks of a fall. They were distinct, patterned, the clear and brutal imprint of a large hand that had gripped her and squeezed hard. This, he thought, was not sickness. This was violence, as if the thought had summoned it. The world outside changed. The steady whine of the wind escalated into a roar, a storm. One of the violent, sudden tempests of the high desert was rolling in off the gray hills to the east. The first crack of thunder vibrated through the log walls. From the barn, Ashbolt let out a short, nervous whinny. The sound prickled the skin on Hale's neck. It was a signal of unease, a sense of something wrong that the animal felt. And now, so did he. Cassia whimpered in her sleep, the thunder penetrating her fevered dreams. Hale moved to the hearth, adding another log to the fire. He sat in the remaining chair, the map and tags heavy in his shirt pocket. He was a man who had sought isolation, who had built his life on the principle of non-interference. He had lost his wife and son to diphtheria 5 years prior, and the loss had scoured him out, leaving him hollowed and weary. He wanted no part of other people's troubles. Yet he had brought this trouble into his home. He sat for a long time, watching her, listening. The storm raged, the cabin hissing with rain, but inside, a change was happening. Her breathing, which had been so shallow and fast, was slowing. The ragged gasps were smoothing out. The willow bark and the sage tea were doing their work. The fever was fighting, but it was no longer winning. He felt a strange, unwelcome surge of something. It was not just responsibility. It was a fierce, protective anger at the bruises on her wrist. It was a primal fear, not of her sickness, but of her dying. He had failed to save his family. He would not fail this stranger. Sometime near 3 a.m, the storm passed, leaving a dripping, exhausted silence. The fever broke. Her eyes opened. They were not clear. They were cloudy with fever and confusion, but they were open, and they were focused on him. She stared, her mind struggling to place the face, the log ceiling, the strange, warm room. Hale leaned forward, not daring to speak. Her hand, the one without the bruises, moved, clutching at the rough linen of his shirt. Her grip was surprisingly strong. Her lips moved, and this time, it was not delirium. It was a whisper, raw and desperate, forced from the very bottom of her soul. "Don't let," she rasped, her throat raw. "Don't let them get Silver Ridge." Her eyes rolled back, and her hand fell away. She was asleep, a true, deep sleep this time, her breathing finally even. Hale Mercer sat frozen in the chair. The lamp guttered, casting shadows that danced on the walls. He was alone again, but the solitude was gone. He was now the keeper of a secret, a map, and a promise. And he knew, with the certainty of a man who understands the frontier, that the trouble he had carried from Redwater Crossing was only just beginning. It was 2 days before the fever truly released its grip. For those 2 days, Hale lived in a suspended state, His world reduced to the cot in the corner, the temperature of the water in the basin, and the sound of her breathing. He moved with the quiet economy of a man long accustomed to his own company, but his focus was absolute. He slept in the chair by the cold hearth, his boots on, waking at her slightest murmur. On the third morning, he awoke to find her watching him. The change was stark. The fever was gone. Her eyes, which he now saw were a deep, clear gray, were lucid. They were also filled with a profound, animal terror. She was propped up on one elbow, the rough blanket clutched to her chest. "Where am I?" Her voice was a dry scrape, unrecognizable from the delirious whispers. "Juniper wash," Hale said. He stood, his joints stiff, and moved to the stove. "My ranch. You've been here 2 days. You collapsed in Redwater, at the church." The memory hit her. Her eyes widened, the terror flashing, and she visibly scanned the room, looking for exits, for threats. "Who are you?" "Hale Mercer." He dipped a tin cup into the water bucket. "The fever's broken. You need water." He crossed the room and held it out. She flinched as he approached, her body tensing, her gaze dropping to his hands, as if expecting a blow. He stopped, holding the cup steady. He saw the bruises on her wrist, stark and purple against her pale skin. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, his voice flat. She stared at him, her mind working, weighing the unknown threat of this man against the known threat she had fled. Slowly, cautiously, she reached out with her unbruised hand and took the cup. Her fingers trembled so badly that water slopped over the rim. She drank, greedy and desperate, the water spilling down her chin. When she finished, she sank back onto the cot, exhausted by the effort. Her gaze fell on the small table by his chair. On it, unfolded, lay the oilcloth pouch. A choked sound came from her throat. She scrambled for it, a desperate, crab-like motion that tore at her strength. "Mine!" she gasped, clutching it. Hale held up his hands, backing away. "I found it, sewn into your dress. You were talking in the fever." She froze, her eyes wide. What did I say?" "You said Elijah Wynne. You said Silver Ridge." The fight went out of her. The tension that had held her rigid dissolved, and she began to weep. It was not a loud, theatrical grief. It was a silent, racking series of sobs that shook her entire body. The kind of weeping that comes after terror has passed and only loss remains. Hale turned his back. He felt like an intruder. He went to the stove, poked the fire, and added broth to a small pot. He gave her the dignity of his silence. After a long time, the sobbing subsided into hitched, watery breaths. "He was my father," she whispered, her voice thick. Hale turned, leaning against the dry sink. He waited. "Elijah Wynne," she said, her voice stronger, but brittle. "He was a prospector. All his life, he followed the seams. He read the rocks. He wasn't a businessman. He was a dreamer, but he was a good man." She touched the pouch. "He found it. After 20 years of searching, he found it, a load so rich it scared him. He called it Silver Ridge." She looked up, her gray eyes burning with a new fever. The fever of injustice. "He wanted to file it, to build me a house, a real house, not a boarding room. He was so proud." "What happened to him?" Hale asked, his voice low. "He trusted the church," she said, the words bitter. "He trusted Reverend Pike. He was a religious man in his own way. He believed God had guided him to the strike. As an act of faith, he gave Pike a copy of his map, for safekeeping. While he went to finalize the assays, her breath hitched. He never came back from the assay office. They said it was a sickness in his heart. Dr. Keats pronounced him dead. They buried him before I could even see him." Hale remained still, but his eyes narrowed. "Keats. I knew what my father had. I knew he was strong. When the grief passed, I went to Pike. I asked for the map, my inheritance." She described the meeting in the church vestry. Reverend Pike, all black wool and sympathy, his voice smooth as oiled wood, and Dr. Keats, who just happened to be there, wringing his hands, smelling of camphor. They told me my father had been troubled, she said, her voice dripping with scorn. That he feared the sin of greed. They said he bequeathed his unfiled discovery to the church, for the good of the town. And a third man, Victor Leland, dressed in a fine suit, smelling of cigars and the railroad. He talked about progress and a new depot for Redwater Crossing. They offered me $100, she whispered, her face pale. A charitable gift from the church. All I had to do was sign a paper. A quit-claim deed. Hale stated. It was not a question. She nodded. I knew what it was. I told them no. I told them I had my father's original markers and his assay tags. I told them they were thieves. Her face hardened, and for a second, Hale saw the woman she was beneath the sickness. Pike. He changed. His eyes went cold. He said I was hysterical. He said I was sick with grief. Keats stepped forward, holding a small bottle, a calming draught. She touched her bruised wrist, her face twisting. I refused. He grabbed me. Keats. He was stronger than he looks. He held my arm, forcing my hand back until I thought my wrist would snap. He held me down. Pike held the cup to my lips. They made me drink. Laudanum, Hale said. It was sweet and thick. I tried to run. I got out of the vestry. I made it to my room at the boarding house. But the walls were moving. The owner, Mrs. Prentice, she's one of Pike's flock. She threw me out, said I was drunk, said I was bringing sickness. She was shaking again, but with rage, not cold. I tried to get to the marshal, but he's at the county seat, 50 miles away. I knew I was fading. My only thought was the church, not Pike. The church, the building. If I could just get to the steps, in front of the town. I could tell them all what he did. I made it to the yard, and the bell was so loud. Then, nothing. Until I woke up here. Hale's jaw was tight. The whole rotten story clicked into place. He walked to the table and, this time, he was the one who emptied the oilcloth pouch, the map fragment, the 3 lead gray assay tags, and one other item. A small, flat piece of juniper wood, carved into the shape of a crescent moon, with a single, sharp notch in its curve. Hale looked at Cassia. What is this? My father's marker, she said, touching it. He carved them. It was his signature. Hale picked up the map fragment. In the bottom right corner, next to the neatly inked name, Elijah Wynne, was a blank space. It looked incomplete. He took the small wooden crescent. He placed it on the paper, fitting it into the blank space. It fit perfectly. The crescent shape was the final part of the signature, and the sharp notch aligned precisely with a drawn symbol of a mountain peak on the map's border. It was a key, a physical seal. Hale stood. He walked to the single window, looking out at the endless, indifferent plateau, at the steady, relentless turning of his windmill. The pieces were all there, but one was missing. He found it in the rumors he'd heard in town. Victor Leland, he said, half to himself. The railroad has been surveying east of Redwater. He turned back to her. Leland's buying up land. He wants to put a depot there, but the land is worthless, unless there's a reason to stop. A reason like a massive silver strike. He said Silver Ridge would fuel the engine of progress. She whispered. He said the town would boom. A boom, Hale said. Built on your father's claim, with Pike and Keats as his silent partners. He turned from the window and crossed to a small, dusty shelf above his dry sink. He took down a square tin box, wiping a film of dust from the lid. He opened it. Inside were old papers, tied with a ribbon his dead wife's letters. He deliberately ignored them, his face tightening for a brief, painful second. Beneath them was another letter, folded and businesslike. My lawyer, he said, his voice rough. Back when I filed on Juniper Wash, he was an honest man, died in Tucson 2 years back. He wrote me instructions. He unfolded the letter, the paper crackling. He scanned the neat, dark ink. Here, he said. He read aloud, his voice low and certain. Mining law in this territory is simple. First in time, first in right. But first means two things. 1. Staking the claim with markers on the land. 2. Filing the plat and the assay report with the county registrar in Sable County. He looked at Cassia, his gaze intense. Did your father file? He was going to, she said, her voice desperate. He'd staked it. He had the assays done. He gave Pike the map copy after he got the assays. Then he got sick. Hale's eyes went back to the letter. A claim is considered unperfected until it is registered. From the date of the assay, the filer has 90 days to register at the county seat. If he fails to register in that time, the claim lapses. It becomes open ground again. Anyone can ride out, restake it, and file it as a new claim. A new, cold dread entered the room. Hale picked up one of the assay tags. He read the date stamped into the lead. His blood ran cold. He counted in his head. When was this assay? He asked, though he already knew. 3 months ago, she stammered, trying to count. It was 86 days ago. 4 days. Hale nodded grimly. They don't need to forge inheritance papers. They don't need your signature at all. All they have to do is wait. Wait. 4 more days. Your father's claim expires. It's public land. Leland, or Pike, or any man they pay can ride to Silver Ridge. Pull your father's markers, put down new ones, and file a fresh claim at the Sable County office. Your map, your father's work, the assays, it all becomes theirs, and it will be perfectly, horribly legal. They'll have stolen it without breaking a single law. Cassia pushed herself up, her face ashen with a sickness worse than the fever. No, I have to go now. She swung her legs over the side of the cot, but the ground rushed up to meet her. She swayed, dizzy, and would have fallen if Hale hadn't crossed the room in 2 strides to steady her. He put his hands on her shoulders, pushing her gently but firmly back onto the cot. You can't even stand. But 4 days, she pleaded, tears of frustration welling. They'll take it. They think you're dead, Hale said, the last piece clicking into place, or that you'd be dead by now. That's why they threw you out, the laudanum, the fever. Keats would pronounce you dead of a sudden contagion. Pike would bless your poor, lost soul at Sunday service. And on Monday, Leland would file the papers. Clean. He looked at her. Truly looked at her. Your collapse in the churchyard was the only thing that saved you. It forced their hand. They had to disown you in front of the town, but it put you in my path. A long silence filled the cabin, broken only by the steady, rhythmic complaint of the windmill. Hale made a decision. It settled on him, heavy and solid as his rifle stock. He had run from the world, from connection, from anything that could be lost, but the world had just fallen onto his cot. He took the lawyer's letter and folded it, placing it back in the tin. He carefully gathered the map fragment, the assay tags, and the carved wooden crescent. He put them back in the oilcloth pouch. He tucked the pouch deep into his own shirt pocket and buttoned the flap. He turned to her. First, he said, his voice final and absolute, you get your strength back. You will eat the broth I am making. You will drink the rest of that tea, you will stand, and then you will walk. He met her gray, terrified gaze and held it. And then, Hale Mercer said, we will protect your right. A community as small and dry as Redwater Crossing holds onto a rumor like a starving man holds a crust of bread. It is chewed, savored, and passed along until it is unrecognizable. The story Hale Mercer had interrupted the vagrant girl collapsing was not enough. It needed more. Reverend Pike and Hiram Keats, in their separate spheres of influence, provided it. The rumor began as a whisper in the mercantile. The fever. Keats says it's a lung fever, fast and fatal. By noon, it had crossed the street to the saloon. A contagion. She brought it from El Paso. Hale Mercer has doomed us all by taking it to his ranch. He's poisoned his own water, and the river runs from his land to ours. By nightfall, it was a dark, established fact, repeated by husbands to their wives over meager dinners. It's the silver. Pike says she's a greedy woman. Come to jump a claim. The fever is God's judgment on her. It's a curse, a silver curse. The next Sunday, Hale Mercer's usual place on the back bench of the church was conspicuously empty. He was at his ranch, watching Cassia take her first unaided steps across the cabin floor, her balance shaky, her face pale but determined. In town, Reverend Pike stood at his pulpit. He did not need to name them. The entire congregation knew. "There is a sickness in this town," Pike declared, his voice thundering in the small adobe room. "A sickness of the soul. Men look to the hills." He gestured, his long finger pointing west toward the ridges. "And they see not God's creation, but treasure. They see the glint of silver. But I tell you, that glint is the devil's eye. Winking at you, it is the temptation that turns brother against brother, that rots the heart with avarice." He paused, letting the silence press down on them. "And when the Lord sends a sign," he continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial hiss, "when he marks the unclean, when he sends a fever to purge the greedy, what do? Do we honor his judgment? Do we cast out the sickness?" He looked at the empty back bench. "Or do we embrace it? Do we invite the plague into our homes, coddling the very sin that seeks to destroy us?" Hiram Keats did not work with fire and brimstone. He worked with fear and medicine. He sat at the saloon, nursing a small whiskey, his black bag on the table. "It's a miasma," he explained to two worried-looking ranchers. "A bad air. It gets into the lungs. This girl, she was wandering for days, no doubt drinking from tainted water. She's riddled with it. I told Pike, 'Reverend, we must quarantine,' I told him." "Is it true," one rancher asked, "that Mercer just took her?" Keats shook his head, a mask of profound, medical sadness. "He acted rashly. He was always a solitary man, Hale. Grief addled him, I suppose, but now he has the sickness at his own hearth. He is, I am afraid, a danger to us all. I would not ride near Juniper Wash. I would not touch anything that comes from it." The poison worked. When Hale rode into town 3 days later for cornmeal and kerosene, the street fell silent. Men turned their backs. Women pulled their children inside. The town had collectively turned its face from him. He went to the forge. Thaddeus Crow, the blacksmith, was the only man who had not joined the chorus. He was hammering a glowing iron bar, the rhythm a steady clang thud that drowned out the town's whispers. Hale waited. Thaddeus finished the piece, plunging it into the slack tub with a violent hiss. He turned, wiping his face with a sooty arm. "They're fools." "Hale," Thaddeus said, his voice a low rumble. "But fools with pitchforks are still dangerous." "I know. It's more than that." The blacksmith lowered his voice, though they were alone. "It's Leland, the railroad man. He's had 2 men in town for a week. They don't drink at the saloon. They don't play cards. They just watch. They ride the East Road, the one that passes the turnoff to your land. They wear city hats and ride good horses." Hale nodded, his face grim. "They're waiting. Waiting for what? For a claim to lapse or for a girl to die?" Thaddeus looked at his anvil. "She's not sick with a fever." "She was," Hale said. "Not with a contagion. She was poisoned and beaten." The blacksmith's massive hands clenched on the hammer handle. "Pike and Keats." It was a statement. "And Leland." Hale finished. "Be watchful, Thaddeus. It's you who needs to be watchful." "Hale, they're not just watching the road. They're watching you." 2 more days passed. The 90-day limit was a ticking clock. They had 1 day left. Cassia was walking. She moved with a stiff, pained grace, but the strength was returning to her legs. The color was coming back to her face. She was quiet, but her eyes were alive. taking in every detail of the cabin, of Hale's routine. That morning, she spoke. "We are out of salt." Hale stopped packing the saddlebags. He was preparing to ride to the county seat at Sable County. A full day's ride, alone. "I can get it when I'm there." "No," she said. Her voice was thin, but it held a steel he hadn't heard before. "I am going with you to Sable County, and I will not ride in here. Weak. I need to go to town." "Cassia, you heard Thaddeus. The town thinks I'm a ghost, or a curse," she said, pulling her father's worn woolen scarf from her small bundle of possessions. She wrapped it around her neck. "It's time they saw I'm neither." He looked at her. She was terrified. Her hands were visibly shaking, but her chin was high. He saw in her the same stubborn grit that had kept her alive, the same will that had kept her crawling toward the church. He was not just protecting a victim. He was partnered with a survivor. "All right," he said, his voice quiet. "We'll ride in. We need supplies for the trip anyway." They rode into Redwater Crossing side by side. Ashbolt, Hale's horse, was steady. The mare Hale had given Cassia, a gentle buckskin, was nervous, sensing the tension from her rider. It was worse than Hale's visit alone. The street emptied, doors shut. Wooden window shutters were latched with a series of sharp, hostile clicks. The town was holding its breath. They dismounted in front of the mercantile. "Stay here," Hale said. "No." She slid from the saddle before he could stop her. Her knees buckled on landing, and she grabbed the hitching rail to steady herself. "I'm done hiding," she said, her voice a low tremor. Hale's jaw set. He put his hand on her elbow, and they walked up the 3 wooden steps and pushed open the door. The store was full of a thick, damning silence. Mrs. Abernathy, the proprietor's wife, stood behind the counter. 2 women, one of whom was Mrs. Prentice, the boarding house owner who had thrown Cassia out, stood near the fabric bolts. They all froze. Mrs. Abernathy's eyes went wide, then narrowed into slits of pure venom. "We're closed." "I need salt, Mrs. Abernathy," Hale said, his voice polite but cold as iron. "And coffee, and flour. We don't serve you." "Mrs. Abernathy snapped, her gaze fixed on Cassia. "And we don't serve that?" "Mrs." Prentice took a step back, as if Cassia might leap at her. "It's the fever girl. She's alive. She'll kill us all." "She's not sick," Hale said, his voice rising, a warning edge in it. "She's a curse, Mrs." Prentice shrieked. "Pike said she brought the silver curse." Cassia let go of Hale's arm. She felt dizzy, the room swimming slightly. But she would not faint. Not again. She saw the sacks of salt stacked near the counter. She took one step, then another, her hand trembling as she reached for the smallest bag. We just need salt," she whispered, her throat dry. "Mrs." Abernathy moved with a shocking, sudden speed. She lunged from behind the counter and shoved Cassia, hard, in the shoulder. "Don't you touch my goods, you harlot!" she screamed. The shove was brutal. Cassia was still weak. She stumbled backward, crashing into a barrel of dried beans. She didn't cry out. She didn't fall. She just caught herself, her shoulder throbbing, her eyes wide with the shock and humiliation of the blow. She instinctively clutched the scarf at her neck, her father's scarf, her fingers digging into the wool as if it were the only solid thing in the world. Her eyes were dry, burning with an unshed, angry grief. Hale moved. He did not rush. It was a deliberate, terrifyingly calm motion. He took one long stride and placed his body directly between Cassia and the 3 women. He was not tall, but he was as solid as the high desert rock. He shielded her completely. The women fell silent. Hale Mercer's face was unreadable, but his eyes were not. They were fixed on Mrs. Abernathy. He did not speak. He reached into his pocket, pulled out 2 silver coins, and dropped them onto the counter. The sound in the silence was as loud as a gunshot. "For the salt," he said, his voice lethally quiet. He reached back, his hand finding Cassia's elbow. He did not grab her. He held her, supporting her. "And the flour," he added. And the coffee? Terrified, her face pale. Mrs. Abernathy scrambled to fill a sack. Hale never took his eyes off her. He took the supplies, tucked them under one arm, and with the other, guided Cassia out of the store. As they stepped onto the porch, he felt it. The entire town had been watching. The line was not just drawn, it was carved in stone. He had publicly, finally, chosen his side. He had chosen this woman over the town, over the church, over everything. And he knew, as he helped her onto the mare, that they would never forgive him for it. The ride back to Juniper Wash was silent. Cassia's shoulders shook, but she did not make a sound. That night, the wind picked up, a high, lonely keen over the plateau. Hale sat in his chair, cleaning his Winchester, the oilcloth pouch with Cassia's claim safe in his shirt. Cassia was asleep on the cot, her breathing fitful. He heard it, a faint scrape against the cabin door. Not a knock, a drag. He was on his feet in an instant, the rifle in his hands, his stockinged feet making no sound on the floorboards. He moved to the door and listened. Only the wind. He waited a full minute. Then, slowly, he lifted the latch and opened the door an inch. Nothing, just the vast, moonlit dark. He opened the door wider, and he saw it, drawn on the wood, thick and black, was a single, large X. It was made of charcoal, the mark of an outcast, a target, a curse, a final, unsigned warning. Hale looked at it for a long time. This was Pike's work, or his followers. This was the town's answer. He felt a cold, clean anger settle in his gut. He did not wake Cassia. He stepped back inside, took a rag from the dry sink, and dipped it in the water bucket. He went back to the door and, with steady, methodical motions, he wiped the X away. He scrubbed until the wood was clean, leaving only a dark, wet smudge that the wind began to dry. He closed the door and latched it. He then walked to the shelf, took down his heavy storm lantern, and uncapped the fuel. He filled it to the brim. He trimmed the wick, lit it, and adjusted the flame until it burned with a high, white, steady light that did not smoke. He unlatched the door again, stepped out onto his porch, and hung the lantern on the iron hook by the door frame. It threw a brilliant, defiant square of light onto the hard-packed earth of his yard, a beacon in the immense, hostile dark. It was a signal to any man watching from the ridges, to Thaddeus Crow's city hats. It said, "I am here, I am awake, and I am not running." The light of the hanging storm lantern was still burning when the sun came up. It was a pale, useless flame against the harsh white light of the new day. Hale had been awake since 4, watching the ridgeline, his rifle clean and ready by the door. The X was gone, but the violation remained. It had changed the air in the cabin. The silence, once companionable, was now taut, stretched thin with unspoken danger. When Cassia emerged from the cot, she was wearing one of his own oversized linen shirts over her mended dress. She had washed her hair in the basin, and it hung in damp, pale strands. She looked stronger. The hollows under her eyes were less pronounced. She walked to the door, looked at the wet, scrubbed patch where the X had been, and then at the lantern, still burning in the daylight. She looked at Hale. She did not ask. He did not offer. It was a silent, shared understanding. The siege had begun. "I cannot be idle," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I must earn my keep, and I must be strong enough to ride." Hale nodded, accepting her terms. He had work. He always had work. He was a man who believed the world could be kept at bay by a strong fence and a full barn. He led her to the barn. The air inside was warm, smelling of hay, horse, and leather. He pointed to a pile of tack in the corner. "The cinch on that saddle is frayed. The bridle is split." She picked up the heavy saddle. "Do you have an awl and waxed thread?" He provided them. She sat on a hay bale, the heavy leather skirt of the saddle across her lap, and began to work. Her hands, though pale and marked by the ordeal, were steady. She pushed the awl through the thick leather with a focused grunt, her stitches small and even. Hale watched her for a moment, then turned to his own work. He shod the buckskin mare, the clang of his hammer on the anvil ringing a sharp counterpoint to the quiet shush of her thread pulling through the leather. Later, she moved to the paddock. Ashbolt, Hale's gray gelding, watched her with wary intelligence. He was a one-man horse, but Cassia did not approach him. She moved toward the far side, where a young, gangly colt, a late-season surprise, stood watching, all legs and nervous eyes. Hale stopped his work, leaning on the paddock rail. He expected her to try and rope it, or corner it. Instead, she just stood 10 yards away, her hands loose at her sides. She did not look at the colt. She looked at the ground, humming a low, tuneless song. The colt's ears pricked. It took a step, snorted, then another. For an hour, she just existed. She let the colt investigate her, never reaching, never pushing. By noon, the colt was lipping at the cuff of her sleeve, its fear replaced by curiosity. Hale had been trying to get a halter on that colt for 2 weeks. She had done more in one morning with quiet and patience than he had with rope and determination. The next morning, the air had a new, sharp bite. The high desert autumn was ending. The first real cold was settling in. Cassia stepped out of the cabin, hugging herself, her breath a white plume. The thin fabric of her dress was no match for the wind. Hale was walking from the trough, a bucket in each hand. He saw her shiver, a violent, bone-deep tremor. He set the buckets down hard. He unbuttoned his heavy canvas duster, the one he had worn into town, the one he had first wrapped her in. He walked over and, without a word, swung it around her shoulders. It was an act of pure utility. The duster was huge on her, swallowing her small frame, the hem dragging in the dust, but as he settled the weight on her shoulders, his hands, calloused and rough, brushed the side of her neck, just below her ear. It was an accident, a simple, fleeting contact, but it stopped the world. She froze, her skin prickling where he had touched. She looked up, her gray eyes wide, her lips parted. He was standing very close, his hands still on the collar of the coat. He stared down at her, his expression tight, his eyes tracing the line of her jaw. The air between them became thick, heavy, and quiet, save for the keen of the wind. He could smell the faint, clean scent of the lye soap she had used. She could feel the heat radiating from his chest. A full 5 seconds passed. Then, as if discovering his hands were on fire, Hale snatched them back. He took a step away, his face hardening into its usual impassive mask. "Wind's sharp," he said, his voice gruff. He picked up his buckets and strode to the cabin, his back rigid. Cassia stood rooted, clutching the lapels of the coat. It was still warm from his body. She pulled it tighter, burying her face in the collar, and felt a strange, terrifying sense of safety. They found a new rhythm, bound by the shared, unspoken deadline. They had to leave for Sable County in 1 day. They worked, side by side, preparing for the 2-day journey. Behind the cabin, where the sun hit the south wall, she found a patch of wild herbs, sage, some tough-stalked mint, and a few late-blooming chamomile flowers. "We should dry these," she said. "For the winter." Hale looked at her. The winter. She was speaking as if there was a winter, as if there was a future beyond the next 3 days. The simple, hopeful domesticity of the act struck him. "All right," he said. He found scrap lumber, and for an hour, they worked together. He sawed and hammered. She held the pieces steady. Their hands brushed as she passed him nails. This time, they both pulled back. A quick, nervous retraction. When they were done, they had a sturdy, rough-hewn rack. She tied the herbs in small bunches, her fingers deft, the air filled with their sharp, clean scents. As she tied the last bunch of chamomile, a small, genuine smile touched her lips. It was the first he had ever seen. It lit her face, chasing the shadows from her eyes, making her look, for a moment, like a girl who had never known terror. "My father," she said softly. "He always said chamomile could calm the devil." Hale stopped, hammer in hand. He watched that smile, a painful tightness gripping his own chest. It was a feeling he had buried, a recognition of life, and it hurt. That afternoon, while he was in the barn, she found a piece of charcoal from the hearth and a flat piece of pine shingle. She sat on the porch, wrapped in his duster, and wrote. Her letters were careful, elegant. You saved me in the place where men come to pray. She did not sign it. She left the shingle on the rough table inside, propped against the water bucket. When Hale came in for supper, he saw it. He stopped. He read the words. He picked up the piece of wood, his thumb tracing the soft black letters. He looked over at her. She was busy at the stove, her back to him, but he could see the flush on her neck. He said nothing. He placed the shingle on the small shelf above his dry sink, next to his wife's tin bucks, a piece of his past next to a piece of his present. The next morning, their last day, he brought out the gun. It was not his rifle. It was a small, 2-shot Derringer, small enough to fit in a coat pocket. He laid it on the table with a box of 2 cartridges. The ride to Sable is long, he said, his voice all business. The men watching, they know the deadline. They won't let us just ride out. If we get separated, you need this. Cassia stared at the gun. It was a heavy, ugly piece of metal. I've never fired a gun. I'll teach you. He took her 100 yards from the cabin, to where the arroyo cut deep into the land. He set up a tin can on a rock. He showed her how to open the breech, to slot the fat, stubby cartridges in. Her hands shook, and she dropped one. Keep your hand steady, he commanded, his voice impatient. I am trying, she snapped, frustration making her bold. She raised the gun, but it was heavy, and her wrist wavered. She closed her eyes and pulled the trigger. The click was loud, but there was no shot. She hadn't cocked the hammer. Hale sighed. It was a sound of deep exasperation. Give it here. He took it, cocked the hammer, and handed it back. Now, hold it with 2 hands. She did. She aimed. The barrel danced. You're fighting it. You're anticipating. Just let it. He stopped, frustrated. He stepped up behind her. Here. His body was suddenly, overwhelmingly close. She stiffened, her back grazing his chest. He smelled of soap and gunpowder. Relax your shoulder, he said, his voice low, his mouth just beside her ear. He placed his right hand over her 2 hands, engulfing them. He did not ask permission. He just took control. His grip was firm, warm, and absolute. His other hand came to rest on her shoulder, his thumb pressing lightly into the hollow of her collarbone. Breathe out, he murmured. She was trapped, surrounded by him. She could feel the solid, steady rhythm of his breathing. Her own heart was a frantic bird in her chest. You don't aim a gun like this, he said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to travel directly from his chest into her back. You point it, like you're pointing your finger. Now, don't pull the trigger. Squeeze it, slowly. His hand tightened over hers, his fingers pressing her own against the trigger. The world narrowed to that single point of pressure, the heat of his body, and the sound of his breath. Crack! The gun jumped, the explosion shockingly loud. The tin can disappeared from the rock. A heavy silence fell. They were still standing in the same position, locked together. His hand was still covering hers. His hand was still on her shoulder. Her back was still pressed against his chest. She could feel his heart. A slow, heavy thud, thud, thud against her shoulder blades. They both realized it at the same time. Cassia lurched forward, breaking the contact, gasping as if she had just come up for air. Hale stepped back, his face flushed dark under his tan. He cleared his throat. You see, he said, his voice strained, too loud. You just squeeze. She nodded, not trusting herself to look at him. She was shaking, but not from the recoil. That afternoon, he was splitting the last of his wood for the winter, preparing to be gone for days. He worked with a savage, focused energy, the axe rising and falling, splitting the pine rounds with clean, sharp cracks. He came inside, sweating despite the cold, and went to the basin. He had a split callus on his palm, and it was bleeding. He cursed under his breath as he poured lye soap into his hand, the wound stinging. Cassia saw him wince, She put down the bridle she was mending and went to him. "Let me," she said. He stopped, his hand dripping red-tinged. "Soapy water. It's nothing." "It will fester on the trail," she insisted. She took the rag from him, rinsed it in the clean water from the bucket, and gently, firmly, took his hand. He did not resist. He stood, towering over her, as she meticulously cleaned the wound. Her touch was incredibly light. He was a man who had not been touched with simple kindness in 5 years. It was unnerving. She finished, drying his palm with a clean corner of the rag. The split was angry and red. From her pocket, she took a tiny tin of salve she had brought from her belongings. She dipped her finger in and, very gently, began to rub it into the raw skin. Her thumb moved in slow, small circles. Hale watched the top of her head, the pale, shining part in her hair. He felt the sting of the wound fade, replaced by the strange, electric warmth of her touch. When she was done, she did not immediately let go. She held his large, rough, wounded hand in her 2 small, clean ones. Then, in a gesture so simple, so quiet, it stunned him. She bowed her head and rested her forehead for a single second against the back of his knuckles. It was not a kiss. It was a vow. A thank you. An act of fealty. Hale's breath caught in his throat. He had faced down armed men, blizzards, and grief. But this gesture undid him. He pulled his hand back as if her skin were a hot coal. She stepped away, her face burning, suddenly terrified she had crossed a line. The salve will help," she stammered. That night, their last night, the cabin was suffocatingly small. They sat by the fire, the plates from their meager supper of cornbread and beans on the floor. The lantern on the porch threw its defiant light. But inside, the fire was the only illumination. The deadline was tomorrow. The ride was tomorrow. The confrontation was tomorrow. They could not speak of it. "The wind is dropping," Hale said, staring into the flames. It was the first thing either had said in an hour. "That's good," she replied, her voice small. "The road will be faster." Silence fell again, thick and heavy. From the ridge, a coyote yipped, a sharp, lonely cry that was answered by a long, mournful howl. Cassia shivered, pulling the duster tighter around her. The sound was the perfect expression of the desolation she felt. Hale noticed. He looked at her, then at the small gap under the cabin door, where a pencil-thin line of cold air was seeping in. He didn't speak. He didn't put more wood on the fire. He just shifted his chair. It was a small movement, perhaps only 6 inches. He angled it slightly, moving his body, his shoulder, his entire presence, directly into the path of the draft. He created a small, human wall, shielding her from the cold. It was not a grand gesture. It was a small, almost unconscious adjustment, a realignment. But Cassia saw it. She saw him deliberately place himself between her and the cold night. She looked at his profile, silhouetted against the fire. He was still staring into the flames, his face hard and unreadable. But he had answered the coyote's howl. He had answered the X on the door. He had answered her. She didn't say thank you. She didn't need to. She pulled the heavy coat around her, settled into the small pocket of warmth he had created. And, for the first time since her father died, she felt the iron band of fear around her chest loosen. They sat in silence, 2 lonely people by a fire, waiting for the dawn that would bring the reckoning. The last night at Juniper Wash was awake. They did not sleep. They sat in the small, fire-lit cabin, the saddlebags packed and waiting by the door. The lantern Hale had hung on the porch still burned, a small, bright challenge against the enormous, waiting dark. The deadline was not a day away. It was here. Dawn would mark the last day to file the claim. The ride to Sable County was a full day, perhaps 8 hours if they pushed the horses. They would have to leave in the dark to make it before the registrar's office closed. Hale sat in his chair, his clean Winchester resting across his knees. Cassia sat on the cot, Her father's map and the assay tags now in a leather pouch on a cord around her neck, hidden beneath his shirt and the heavy duster. Every creak of the cabin, every shift of the wind, made her heart leap. The wind died, as it often did in the hours just before dawn. Around 3 in the morning, the silence that fell was absolute, heavy as a shroud. It was Cassia who noticed it first. Her senses, sharpened by weeks of fear, were acute. She lifted her head, her nostrils flaring slightly. "Hale," she whispered. He was instantly alert, his eyes on her, his hands tightening on the rifle. "What? Do you smell that?" He sniffed the air, detecting only the cold ash from the hearth and the faint scent of juniper. Wood smoke. "No." She stood, walking to the door, her head tilted. "It's sharp, oily, like pine resin." Hale was on his feet in an instant. Pine resin, an accelerant. "Turpentine," he snarled. He looked toward the barn. "The hay! They're firing the barn!" He kicked the door open, the lantern light spilling onto the yard. They were there, 2 shadows, moving fast. A third, taller man stood near the corner of the barn, holding a lit torch. He was about to touch it to the dry, brittle hay sticking from the loft. "No!" Cassia screamed. She did not think. She ran, grabbing the half-full bucket of water Hale kept by the door for the horses. "Cassia, get back!" Hale roared, pulling his rifle up. But she was already moving, desperation giving her a speed he had never seen. She ran across the yard, her bare feet silent on the cold, packed earth. The tall man, his face illuminated by the flame, looked up, his eyes wide with surprise. He wore a city hat, Colton Price. Cassia threw the contents of the bucket with all her strength. The water hit the torch and the man's chest. There was a loud hiss, a cloud of stinging smoke, and the torch sputtered, then died, falling to the ground in a shower of embers. Price bellowed. A curse ripped from his throat. Crack! A gunshot exploded from the darkness near the woodpile. The bullet tore a white splinter from the doorframe, exactly where Cassia had been standing a second before. A warning shot. "To the trough!" Hale yelled. He grabbed Cassia's arm and shoved her forward, propelling her toward the long, low stone trough that dominated the middle of the yard. He dived behind it with her, pushing her down, his body shielding hers. He leveraged his Winchester over the stone rim. The yard was a chaotic mess of shadows. The lantern on the porch cast long, unreliable light. "Nowhere to hide. Mercer," Price's voice called out, dangerously close. "We just want the girl. Give her to us, and we'll let you keep your miserable ranch." Another shadow moved near the barn. The man who had fired the first shot. He was raising something, a lantern, his own lantern, trying to get a better look at where they were hiding. It was the mistake Hale had been waiting for. He did not aim for the man. He aimed for the light. He took a steadying breath, let it half out. He squeezed the trigger. The crack of the Winchester was deafening. It was followed by a metallic ping and the bright, shattering pop of glass. The second lantern exploded. The world, in an instant, went from dim light to absolute, suffocating blackness. The only light was the useless lantern on the cabin porch, now 30 yards behind them. "The horses!" Hale yelled, grabbing Cassia. "To the barn! Now!" They ran, staying low, stumbling in the pitch dark. They could hear Price and his man cursing, confused by the sudden blindness. They reached the barn. Ashbolt and the buckskin mare were already saddled, packed with the supplies for the ride to Sable. They were terrified, pulling at their tethers, their eyes white in the gloom. Hale pulled his hunting knife and sliced through the reins. He vaulted onto Ashbolt's back. He turned. Cassia was struggling to mount the buckskin, the mare, smelling the sharp turpentine and panicked by the gunshot. Shied and danced away from her. A shot rang out from the yard, wild in the dark. The bullet whined past Hale's ear. "No time," Hale snarled. He leaned low from his saddle, grabbed Cassia's arm in a steel grip, and hauled her bodily off the ground. "Up now!" She scrambled, half pulled, half climbing, landing hard behind him on Ashbolt's saddle. The terrified buckskin mare, now free, bolted from the barn and disappeared into the night. "Hold on!" Hale yelled. He kicked Ashbolt hard. The powerful gray horse, responding to his master's urgency, leaped from the barn, not toward the road, but straight out onto the open range, heading for the dark, broken line of the hills. Hoofbeats thundered behind them. Price and his man had mounted. They were in pursuit. The chase was not a race. It was a desperate, blind scramble in the dark. Hale pushed Ashbolt, the horse's lungs beginning to burn. Behind them, 2 sets of hoofbeats, spreading out, trying to flank them. Cassia clung to him. She had her arms wrapped tight around his waist, her face pressed against the hard, solid muscle of his back. She could feel the tension in him, the way he moved with the horse, as if they were one creature. She clamped her legs tight, her duster flying out behind them, her heart hammering against his spine. Sparks flew as Ashbolt's iron-shod hooves struck the quartz hidden in the dirt. They were gaining. Price and his man had fresher horses, and they were fanning out, trying to drive Hale toward the canyon pass. "They're pushing us into Black Notch," Hale yelled over the wind and the thunder of the hooves. He was right. The land was rising, funneling them into the one canyon that cut through the ridge. He had no choice but to take it. They plunged into the narrow cut. The rock walls rose up on either side, sheer and black. The sound of the 4 horses was deafening, a frantic, echoing clatter trapped between the walls. "We've got you, Mercer," Price's voice echoed, seeming to come from everywhere at once. "It's a box canyon. Give it up." Hale looked ahead, in the faint, pre-dawn gray. He could see it, a sheer wall of rock, a dead end. He pulled Ashbolt back hard. The horse reared, screaming, fighting the bit, his hooves skittering on the loose rock. They were trapped. Price and his man were just seconds behind. "No!" Cassia screamed, her voice thin with terror. She pointed, her hand shaking as she released her grip on his waist. "To the left there." Hale squinted. "It's a rock slide. It's impassable." "It's a trail," she yelled, her voice desperate. "My father, he used it, the grass. See it where it's broken. It's a shepherd's trail." Hale saw it then, a faint, almost invisible line, no wider than a man, that switched back and forth up the sheer scree slope. It was a goat path. He did not hesitate. He trusted her. "Hold on," he roared. He wrenched Ashbolt's head, turning the horse sharp to the side, and drove his heels in. The gray horse screamed, but it obeyed. It leaped at the slope, scrambling for purchase, loose rock and shale clattering down into the canyon floor. Price and his man rounded the corner. They skidded to a halt, seeing the rock wall. For a second, they were confused, seeing no one. Then Price looked up. He fired. The bullet pinged off the rock, 10 feet below Ashbolt's climbing hooves. He fired again, but they were a moving target, disappearing into the dark. He could not follow. To take a horse up that path in the dark without knowing it was suicide. Hale and Cassia scrambled over the rim of the canyon, disappearing as the first, sick, gray light of dawn touched the sky. They rode for another hour. They rode until Ashbolt's flanks were heaving and lathered, his breath coming in great, ragged gasps, and then the sky, which had been holding its breath, let go. The storm that had been threatening broke with a sudden, violent intensity. A cold, driving rain began to fall, turning instantly to sleet. They were exposed on the high plateau, the wind cutting them to the bone. "We need cover," Hale gasped. "The horse would founder and die if they kept on." Cassia was shivering so hard she could barely speak, but she pointed again. Her hand blew with cold. "There, the line shack, stone." It was a ruin, a 3-sided shepherd's hut made of piled, flat stones, with a rusted piece of tin for a partial roof. It was barely a windbreak, but it was shelter. Hale half fell, half slid from the saddle, pulling Cassia down with him. They stumbled into the tiny space, pulling the exhausted, trembling Ashbolt in after them. The horse filled the small shelter, its body heat and steaming breath instantly fogging the air. Hale and Cassia collapsed against the back wall, sliding to the ground, soaked, frozen, the adrenaline draining away, leaving a bone-deep, aching cold. They sat in silence for a long time. The only sound, the furious hammering of the rain on the tin roof and the gasping breath of the horse. Hale spoke first, his voice raw. "They're not going to stop. We lost them," Cassia chattered, her teeth knocking together. "For now." Hale stared out at the gray sheets of rain. That was Price. He knew we were leaving. He knew the deadline. He failed to stop us tonight. He turned to her, his face a mask of grim realization in the gloom. "He's not just going to ride back to Leland. He's going to ride to the marshal. He'll ride to Sable County. But he won't go as an arsonist," Hale said, thinking it through, the pieces fitting together with sickening clarity. "He'll go as a concerned citizen. He'll swear out a warrant. He'll tell the marshal that Hale Mercer has abducted a sick, feverish woman, that he's holding her against her will to steal her inheritance. He'll have Pike and Keats to swear to it. He'll get a legal piece of paper to come and take you." He met her terrified gaze. "By the time we'd prove it's a lie, the registrar's office will be closed. The deadline will pass. The claim will be theirs, and it will all be legal." The full, suffocating weight of the trap settled on her. They had run, only to be caught in a different, more sophisticated snare. "We can't go back to the ranch," Hale said, his voice a low growl. "Price will be waiting, and we can't just hide. Running just gives them time." He stood, pacing the tiny space not taken by the horse. "So we don't run," he said. A massive clap of thunder exploded directly overhead, shaking the very stones of the hut. In the brilliant, blue-white flash of lightning that followed, his face was illuminated. It was hard, angry, and absolutely resolved. "We ride to Sable. We ride in ahead of him. But we don't just go to the registrar's office. We don't just file the claim." He stopped pacing and looked down at her. "We have to expose them, all of them. Pike, Keats, Leland. We do it in the open." He held out his hand, his calloused, wounded hand. It was not a gesture of comfort. It was an offer, a partnership. Cassia stared at his hand, the hand that had cleaned her wounds, that had held hers when she fired the gun, that had shielded her from the cold. She put her small, cold hand into his. In the next flash of lightning, she pulled herself to her feet, his grip steadying her. They stood side by side, united, their resolve set. "We do it together," Cassia said, her voice no longer shaking. The storm did not break. It shattered. The cold rain, driven by a wind that had the voice of a grieving woman, turned to ice. Sleet, hard as buckshot, began to hammer the small stone ruin. It found every crack in the piled rock walls, driving needle pricks of icy water into their tiny shelter. The tin roof, their only real cover, roared with a deafening, metallic rattle. Ashbolt, the horse, screamed once a high, terrified sound and pressed his massive body harder against the back wall, his heat and his panic filling the space. Cassia was shaking. It was no longer a shiver. It was a violent, uncontrollable series of convulsions that rattled her teeth. The heavy duster, soaked through from the ride, was a trap. A 30-pound weight of sodden, freezing canvas that was sucking the last of her warmth away. Her lips were blue. Hale, crouched beside her, saw it. This was no longer about the chase. This was not about Price or the claim. This was about the next 10 minutes. The fever had broken her body, and the cold was coming to finish the job. He knew this kind of cold. He had seen it take newborn calves. He had seen it take good men. "Cassia!" he yelled over the roar of the ice on the tin. She looked at him, her eyes wide and dull, her mind already retreating. "The coat!" he shouted, his voice rough with an urgency that was close to anger. "It's killing you. You have to get it off. Now!" He turned his back, a deliberate, practical gesture meant to give her modesty in the face of death. He fumbled with the straps on his bedroll, his own fingers stiff and clumsy. He pulled out the one dry thing he owned, a thick, rough-woven wool horse blanket. He heard her fumbling behind him, her chattering teeth punctuated by small, desperate sobs of frustration. The buttons were impossible. Her fingers were numb. Useless. I can't," she wept. He cursed. a low, vicious sound aimed at the storm, at God, at Victor Leland. He turned back. She was hunched over, still wrapped in the heavy, dripping coat. Failing. "Stand up," he commanded. She tried, pushing against the wall, her legs trembling. He did not wait. He stepped in front of her, his body blocking the worst of the wind. He grabbed the front of his duster, the buttons slick and cold. His fingers, calloused and thick, worked them with a brutal efficiency. He ripped the heavy coat from her shoulders, letting it fall to the muddy floor with a wet thud. She stood before him in her thin, soaked dress, shaking so hard she could barely stand. "The dress, too," he said, his voice flat, his eyes fixed on her face, refusing to look lower. "Hail. It's water. It's ice. It will stop your heart." He saw the terror in her eyes, but she nodded. A tiny, jerking motion. She reached for the buttons at her own throat, but her hands were useless. He pushed them aside. "Move!" His fingers, still half frozen, went to the high collar of her dress. He undid the first button, and the second. He was all business, his face a mask of grim necessity. He could feel the cold radiating from her skin. He worked his way down, button by button, until he reached her waist. He pulled the sodden fabric off her shoulders, pushing it down her arms, until she stood in nothing but her thin, damp chemise and petticoat. He grabbed the dry wool blanket, shook it open with a snap, and in one swift, encompassing motion, wrapped it around her. He pulled it tight, cocooning her, his arms wrapping all the way around her, pulling her against the stone wall. "Better?" he asked, his voice a low rasp near her ear. She could only nod, burrowing her face into the rough, dry, blessedly warm wool. He stripped off his own soaked canvas jacket and shirt, tossing them into the corner. He stood for a long moment in his thin undershirt, the ice-cold air hitting his bare skin. The wind sliced at him. He looked at her, huddled in the blanket, and then at the remaining half of the blanket. There was no choice to make. He sat down hard beside her, so close their hips and shoulders pressed together. He pulled the other end of the heavy wool blanket over his own shoulders, wrapping it around them both, creating a small, shared tent of dry wool. They sat in the dark, pressed together from shoulder to knee. The storm raged. Ashbolt stomped, rattling his bit, inside their small cocoon. The shivering slowly, agonizingly, began to subside. The air grew warmer, heated by their shared proximity, smelling of damp skin, wet wool, and the faint, clean scent of the sage he had gathered. Her hands were still outside the blanket, clutched in front of her. They were ice. "Your hands," he grunted. He captured them both in one of his. He pulled them under the blanket, into the small, warm space between their bodies, pressing them flat against his chest. "Hail," she whispered, her voice a shocked puff of air. "Be still," he ordered. He began to rub them, not gently, but with a fierce, restoring friction. His calloused, hard palms moved over her knuckles, her fingers, her wrists, forcing the blood to move, forcing the life back in. It was a practical act, an act of survival, but it was the most intimate thing he had ever done. He was rubbing his bare hands over hers, against his own bare chest. He could feel her thin, fragile bones. She could feel the steady, powerful muscle beneath his undershirt, the heat of his skin. The warmth did not just creep, it flooded. It ran from her hands, up her arms, and spread directly into her chest, to the cold, frightened core of her. A jagged fork of lightning split the sky, illuminating the plateau, for one brilliant, blue-white second. The inside of the hut was bright as day. They were looking at each other. They were not two people. They were one shape, huddled under a blanket. His face was inches from hers. She saw the lines carved at the corners of his eyes, the dark stubble on his jaw, the raw intensity of his gaze. He saw the fullness of her lips, still pale, the pulse beating frantically in her throat, and the way her gray eyes, wide and luminous, held his. All the barriers were gone. The propriety, the distance, the roles of rescuer and victim, they were burned away by the chase. The fire and the cold. The lightning vanished, plunging them back into a darkness that was now absolute and suffocating. They did not move. They did not breathe. They were still held by that frozen image. "Hail," she breathed, her voice so quiet it was almost lost in the wind. It was not a plea. It was a statement. He did not answer. He let go of one of her hands. He raised his fingers, finding her face in the blackness. He was not rough, but he was not gentle. He was certain. His calloused thumb found the line of her jaw, traced it up, and came to rest on the soft skin just below her bottom lip. He felt her breath, warm and sudden, against his knuckle. He tilted her chin up. He hesitated for one single, agonizing heartbeat. A lifetime of loss, of solitude, of 5 years spent building a wall around his heart, held him motionless. She was the one who closed the distance. She leaned that last, impossible inch into his touch. Their lips met. It was a shock. It was cold meeting cold. Then warmth, then fire. It was not the gentle, exploratory kiss of a parlor. It was a desperate, hungry, necessary collision. It was a claim. It was an answer. It tasted of rainwater, of ozone from the lightning, and the faint, metallic tang of fear. It was hesitant for a second, a stunned recognition, and then it deepened. He was not asking. He was taking, but he was also giving all the pent-up warmth and life and anger he had stored for 5 years. Her response was just as desperate. This was the man who had laid down his rifle, the man who had faced down his town for her, the man who had shielded her from the cold. She let go of the blanket in her arms, her real arms, not the ones in a dream, slid up his chest, her small, cold fingers locked behind his neck, her hands tangling in his damp hair, pulling him closer. His hand, the one at her chin, slid down. He traced the long, vulnerable line of her throat, over her collarbone, and came to rest on her back. He felt the sharp, fragile ridges of her spine through the thin, damp chemise. He felt her shiver, but this time it was not from cold. He felt her breath catch, a sudden, sharp intake of air. He paused. His lips never left hers, but the pressure lessened. He stopped. He was giving her a choice. He was not Colton Price. He was not Hiram Keats. He was Hale Mercer, and he was giving her the one thing no one else had the right to say no. She answered by kissing him back. Harder. She pressed her forehead against his. A silent, furious yes. The frantic energy dissolved, replaced by something new, something aching and slow. Their breathing, which had been ragged and panicked, began to sink, to deepen. They were breathing the same air. He shifted, pulling her with him. He was no longer sitting up. He was lying on his side on the hard-packed earth, pulling her down, never breaking the kiss, until she was lying with him. He drew the wool blanket completely over them, cocooning them from the world, from the storm, from the horse that stood breathing beside them. The kiss finally ended, but they did not part. She tucked her head under his chin, her face pressed into the warm, solid hollow of his neck. His arms were locked around her, his hands splayed across her back, holding her as if she were the last piece of solid ground on earth. She was lying against his chest. She could hear it. Thud, 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 thud. The slow, powerful, steady beat of his heart. It was the sound of safety. It was the sound of the rifle being laid on the church steps. It was the sound of the lantern being hung in the dark. He could feel her heart, a frantic, rapid beat against his ribs, slowing. It was like watching the colt in the paddock, its fear finally quieting, its heart rate slowing to match his. Thud, 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 thud. They lay like that for a long time, their bodies pressed together, sharing heat, sharing life. His hand found hers under the blanket, and his fingers, rough and sure, laced with hers. It was a binding, a contract signed in the dark, witnessed by the storm. Outside, the world was changing. The hammering of the sleet softened. The wind, which had been a scream, dropped to a low, mournful moan. The worst of the storm had passed. She was the first to speak, her voice a murmur against his skin. I was so cold. I know, he rasped, his own voice thick. He tightened his grip. I wasn't just afraid of them. She whispered, a confession. I was afraid of everything, of being alone, of dying alone. You are not alone, he said. The 3 words were a vow. They cost him everything, and they gave him everything. She pulled her head back just enough to look at the dark shape of his face. We will make it to Sable. We will, he said. We will tell the truth. We will. They will not win. They will not take my father's legacy. No, he said. They will not. She lifted her chin, and he knew what she was asking. He kissed her again. This kiss was not the first one. There was no desperation in it. There was no fear. This kiss was slow. It was deep. It was warm. It held the taste of salt and the promise of the future. It was a seal on the truth they had just spoken. They did not sleep. They lay tangled together under the single wool blanket, their breathing matched, their fingers laced, listening to the storm die and waiting for the dawn. The sun rose on a drowned world. The high plateau, usually brown and dry, was a landscape of running water. The arroyos turned to churning, muddy rivers. The rain had stopped, but the air was painfully cold. The sky a flat, clean-washed gray. Inside the stone hut, the air was warm and still. Hale and Cassia pulled apart slowly, the wool blanket heavy with their shared heat. They dressed in their still damp clothes, the chill of the fabric a harsh shock against their skin. The intimacy of the night was replaced by a quiet, focused determination. They were no longer 2 strangers. They were a single, unified purpose. They could not ride to Sable County. Not like this. Ashbolt was exhausted, and the main road would be a sea of mud, watched by Price's men. We cannot go forward, Hale said, his voice rough. And we cannot go back to the ranch. There is a third way, Cassia said, her voice quiet but firm. She was pulling on her boots, her movements sure. Nora Bell. Hale looked up. The schoolteacher. She is not like the others. Cassia said, my father spoke with her. She is educated. She came from the East. She understands things, like contracts. And she does not like Reverend Pike. Her schoolhouse is on the north edge of town. It is isolated. We can get there without crossing the main street. It was a risk, but it was the only one they had. They rode Ashbolt slowly, keeping to the low ground, following the gullies carved by the storm. They bypassed Redwater Crossing, the town a smear of wet wood smoke in the distance. The schoolhouse was a small, neat building of whitewashed adobe, with a clean-swept porch and a small corral. A light was on inside. Hale slid from the saddle and helped Cassia down. Her body was stiff, but she did not falter. He stood back, letting her take the lead, his rifle held ready. Cassia knocked. The door opened a moment later. A woman in a plain wool dress, her hair pulled back in a severe bun, stood in the doorway. She was perhaps 40, with sharp, intelligent eyes behind spectacles. She looked at Cassia, at the man behind her, at the exhausted, lathered horse. Her eyes took in the soaked clothes, the bruise on Cassia's wrist, and the grim set of Hale's jaw. Miss Wynne, Nora Bell said, her voice calm, as if she were expecting them. I had heard you were dead. Not yet. Miss Bell, Cassia replied, her voice shaking with cold. Get inside, Nora said, pulling them in. Both of you. The room was warm, dominated by a large cast-iron stove, smelling of ink, paper, and hot coffee. We need your help, Cassia began. I know, Nora said, pouring 2 cups of coffee with a steady hand. You need the law, and you are running out of time. They told her everything, the map, the poison, the deadline, the attack on the ranch, Price's chase. Nora listened without interruption, her face grim. When they finished, she walked to her desk. She did not consult a law book. She was the law book. The mining law of 1872, Nora stated, her voice crisp. You have until tomorrow, Sunday, at the close of business, to file your declaration of mining claim with the registrar in Sable County. If you do not, your father's claim becomes void on Monday morning. We cannot get to Sable, Hale said, his voice flat. Price is on his way there. He'll have a warrant sworn out for my arrest for abduction before we're halfway. We'll be in a cell while the clock runs out. You are correct, Nora said. You cannot win by running, so you must win by standing still. She looked at Cassia. Reverend Pike has built his power on a lie that he speaks for God. Victor Leland has built his power on a rumor that he is bringing the railroad. We must defeat them with the truth, a truth so loud it deafens the entire town. The deadline, Cassia whispered. What about the deadline? We cannot get to the registrar, Nora said, a small, fierce smile playing on her lips. So we will make the law come to us. She turned to Hale. Go to Thaddeus Crow. Tell no one else. Tell him the iron is ready to be struck. He will understand. Hale moved through the pre-dawn shadows, avoiding the main street, and came to the forge. Thaddeus was already awake, the first orange glow of the forge painting the dark. Hale explained the plan. Thaddeus listened, his massive face impassive. A public confrontation in Pike's own church on Sunday. He shook his head. It is a lion's den. Price and his men will be there. Leland will be there. That is the point, Hale said. We need to force them to show their hand. In public. Thaddeus nodded slowly. They will try to take the papers from you. They will try. The blacksmith turned and went to a heavy iron chest. He unlocked it and pulled out a small, heavy black iron box with a thick latch and a key. A hand safe, he said. For a payroll. Put the papers in this. They cannot open it without looking like the thieves they are, not in a church. He handed the safe and the key to Hale. This protects the paper, but what protects you? We walk in unarmed, Hale said. Thaddeus stared at him. You are a fool. If I bring a gun, it is a feud. If they draw a gun on an unarmed man, it is a crime. In front of the whole town. Thaddeus grunted. He picked up his largest forge hammer and placed it by the door. Pike's congregation is sheep. Leland has wolves. You need witnesses who understand the law. The real law. The miner's law. Hale said, first in time, first in right. I have 3 cousins working the dry diggings at Bitter Creek. They and their crews. They hate railroad men and false preachers more than they hate bedrock. Thaddeus pointed to the ceiling, where a long rope connected to a massive steam whistle on the roof. This is the fire signal. It can be heard for 5 miles. When I pull this, it means the forge is in danger. When they hear it, they will come, and they will bring their tools. He met Hale's eyes. I will be at the service, on the back bench. When you stand, I stand. If Price lays a hand on either of you, I will pull that rope, and all the miners in this territory will be your witnesses. Hale returned to the schoolhouse as the sun was fully rising. Cassia had retrieved her saddlebags. She had found it. My father's notebook, she said, her voice trembling. It was a small, leather-bound geological journal. They opened it. Page after page of Elijah Wynn's neat, precise handwriting, detailing rock formations, water sources, and assays. And then, the last entry. It was dated 88 days ago. Have struck the lode, the ridge west of the Shepherd's Pass. It is pure. Assay tags confirm. I will call it Silver Ridge. For my daughter. This is her inheritance. It was signed, Elijah Wynn. And beneath the signature, he had taken his small, crescent-shaped wooden marker, dipped it in ink, and pressed it to the paper. A perfect, unforgeable seal. This, Nora Bell said, her voice shaking with triumph, is not just a claim. This is a last will and testament. Nora went to work. She took a buggy to the rail depot, the one place with a telegraph line not controlled by Pike or his allies. She sent 2 telegrams. The first was to the Sable County Registrar of Deeds, confirming 90-day deadline for Elijah Wynn mining claim. Silver Ridge. Filing party is en route. Please confirm receipt. This created a legal record that the claim was not abandoned. The second telegram was to U.S. Marshal Whitcomb in Sable. Urgent. Conspiracy to commit fraud and illegal land seizure in Redwater Crossing, implicating Reverend Abner Pike, Dr. Hiram Keats, and railroad agent Victor Leland. Evidence of forgery, poisoning, and attempted murder. Evidence will be presented publicly at Redwater Church. Sunday service, tomorrow, November 3rd. Request immediate presence to prevent violence and witness proceedings. She paid the fee. The operator looked at her, his eyes wide. Send it, Nora ordered. There was no guarantee Whitcomb would come. It was a 50-mile ride. But now, he was legally notified. If he ignored it and violence broke out, it would be on his head. They had one night. They spent it in Nora's small spare room, the hand safe on the table between them. The trap was laid. Cassia was terrified. She held the notebook in her lap. I cannot speak in front of them, she whispered. Pike, his voice. He will shout me down. His voice is wind, Nora said, placing a hand on her shoulder. This notebook is rock. You are not a victim tomorrow. Cassia, you are the heir. You are the accuser. Cassia practiced. She stood by the window, staring out at the dark. This is my father's book, she whispered. This is my inheritance. Her voice was a thin reed. Hale, who had been sitting in the corner, silent, stood up. He walked to her. He did not touch her, but he stood so close she could feel his heat. Look at me, he commanded, his voice low. She raised her eyes to his. You are not the girl who collapsed. You are the woman who survived the poison. You are the woman who survived the fire. You are the woman who survived the storm. You are Elijah Wynn's daughter. Tomorrow, you will take back his name. He watched her. She took a deep breath. Her spine straightened. The fear did not leave her eyes, but a cold, hard anger joined it. My name is Cassia Wynn, she said, her voice clear and carrying. I am my father's heir, and you are a liar. Hale nodded. That will do. He walked back to the corner. He picked up his Winchester, which he had been cleaning. He worked the action, the smooth, oily shing-shick filling the small, quiet room. He then deliberately, methodically, ejected every cartridge from the rifle until it was empty. He placed the 5 brass cartridges on the table. He leaned the empty rifle against the wall. Tomorrow, Hale Mercer said, we go in with the truth. It is the only weapon we need. Sunday service at Redwater Crossing had never been so full. The pews were packed, the aisles crowded. Men who had not seen the inside of a church in a decade stood in the back, their hats in their hands, the air thick with the smell of damp wool, stale whiskey, and a sharp, crackling anticipation. This was not piety. It was a reckoning. Every soul in town was there to see who would win the preacher or the ghost. In the front pews, the alliances were clear. Mrs. Abernathy and the boarding house owner, Mrs. Prentice, sat bolt upright, their faces masks of grim self-righteousness. Hiram Keats sat beside them, his black bag on his lap, his skin a pale, doughy white. Victor Leland, the railroad man, stood near the front, looking impatient and clean, his city suit a dark stain against the rough-spun clothes of the townsfolk. And by the door, his tall frame blocking the light, stood Colton Price, his hand resting near his holstered pistol, his gaze scanning the crowd with open contempt. On the back bench, massive and silent, sat Thaddeus Crowe. His arms were crossed over his chest, his face unreadable. Reverend Abner Pike stood at his pulpit, and he was magnificent. The tension in the room was his fuel. He was not preaching, he was commanding. The devil, he boomed, his long finger jabbing at the air. The devil does not come with horns and a pitchfork. He comes as a whisper of silver. He comes as a pretty, feverish face, planting seeds of doubt, turning honest men from their God. He slammed his fist on the Bible. He tempts us with the riches of the earth. But I say to you, this town, this God-fearing town, will not be tempted this Sunday. We cast out the curse this Sunday. We choose progress. We choose prosperity. We choose God's will. A low, uneasy murmur went through the crowd. Pike raised his hands for silence. As you all know, our poor, departed brother, Elijah Wynne, was a devout man, but a troubled one. In his final days, he saw the sin of his discovery. He saw the avarice it would bring. He nodded to Victor Leland. Leland stepped forward, holding a single official-looking document. Reverend Pike is a humble man, Leland said, his voice smooth and clear. Mr. Wynne, in his great wisdom, and attended by Dr. Keats, saw fit to bequeath his unfiled claim to the church. He signed this quitclaim deed, leaving his discovery to be used for the good of all. He held the paper up. As the church's agent for development, I am here today, on this, the last day of legal filing, to formally accept this gift on behalf of the railroad and the new depot, a gift that will make this town thrive. Hiram Keats stood up, his voice oily. I was there. I witnessed his signature. He was at peace. It was perfect. A legal, public, and righteous theft. Bang! The heavy oak-plank church doors were thrown open, crashing against the adobe walls. The entire congregation turned as one. In the doorway, silhouetted against the bright, cold sun, stood Hale Mercer. He was clean-shaven. He wore a clean shirt, and he was completely, conspicuously unarmed. His rifle was gone. His holster was empty. He stepped into the aisle. Then he stepped aside, his hand outstretched. A collective, sucking gasp filled the room. Cassia Wynne walked in. She was not the feverish ghost. She was not the cowed victim from the mercantile. She wore her mended dress. Her father's scarf was tied at her throat, and she was wrapped in Hale's heavy canvas duster. Her pale hair was pulled back, and her gray eyes, though wide with terror, were set with a cold, hard fire. The crowd shrank from her, men and women pushing back into the pews to clear the aisle, as if from a leper. Sacrilege! Pike roared, his face turning a dark, mottled purple. How dare you? You are unclean. Hale ignored him. He walked steadily down the aisle, Cassia's hand gripping his elbow. He stopped directly in front of the pulpit, in the space between the front pews and the altar. He was carrying Thaddeus Crow's black iron hand safe. He set it down on the communion table, directly in front of the Bible. The heavy thud of iron on wood echoed in the sudden, tomb-like silence. It was a sound of finality, a gauntlet thrown. You speak of the devil, Reverend. Hale said. His voice was not loud, but it was low and cold, and it cut through the air. You should know him well. You've been sharing his table. This is madness, Keats stammered, scrambling to his feet. This girl is sick. She is delusional. Marshall, seize this man. He abducted her. He saved me. Cassia said. Her voice, though not strong, was clear. It silenced the room. She let go of Hale's arm. She stood alone, facing them. She looked at the paper in Victor Leland's hand. That, she said, her voice rising, gaining strength, is a lie, and that signature is a forgery. Leland laughed, a short, ugly sound. My dear child, you are unwell. That is your father's name, witnessed by the town doctor. You hold a piece of paper, Mr. Leland, Cassia said, her voice shaking but gaining power. I hold my father's life. Hale turned the key in the iron safe. The lock made a loud, greasy click. He opened the heavy lid. He stepped back, letting her stand before it. She reached in. She took out the oilcloth pouch. She laid the 3 lead-gray assay tags on the table. Clack, clack, clack. She took out the small, notched, crescent-shaped wooden marker. And last, she took out the worn, leather-bound geological journal. This is my father's logbook, she declared, her voice ringing, filled with his own hand. His notes, his science, his signature. She opened it to the last page. The ink was faded, but clear. And this is his last entry, dated 88 days ago. His will. He wrote, "This is her inheritance." He signed his name. She held the journal up for the front pews to see, and he sealed it. She took the small wooden crescent, dipped it in the Reverend's inkwell on the table, and pressed it onto the empty space below his signature. It fit perfectly. a seal, an unforgeable mark. "This is the Silver Ridge claim," she cried, tears of rage and grief finally streaming down her face. "My father's name, my inheritance." "And you," she jabbed a finger at Pike, her whole body trembling. "You tried to poison me for it. You are a thief, and you are a liar." A horrified, profound silence fell. "Hysteria!" Pike bellowed, but his voice was strained. "She is mad, Dr. Keats. Tell them of her sickness. Tell them what you gave her." Nora Bell, sitting quietly in the third pew, stood up. Her sharp, schoolteacher's voice cut through the air. "Yes, Dr. Keats," she said, stepping into the aisle. "Do tell us about the sickness you diagnosed. Was it the same sickness you and Reverend Pike tried to treat in the vestry?" Keats's face was slick with sweat. His eyes darted from Pike to Leland, to the cold, watching crowd. It was a calming draught for her grief, a simple tonic. A tonic. Nora's voice was sharp as glass. "A tonic of laudanum." Dr. Keats flinched, as if struck. "A tonic you administered in a dose so large it was meant to kill. A dose you gave her after she refused to sign your forged deed. A dose you and the Reverend had to force down her throat." Keats snapped. The trap was too perfect. She was hysterical. She was fighting, resisting. We had to hold her down. It was for her own good. He had confessed. To the laudanum, to the assault. A woman in the front pew screamed. On the back bench, Thaddeus Crow stood to his full, towering height. He turned, reached up to the long rope by the wall, and pulled. A deafening, high-pitched shriek blasted from the church roof. The steam whistle, the fire signal. It screamed out over the town, over the ridges, a sound of pure, piercing alarm. "What is that?" Leland yelled. Panicked. Within a minute, a new sound came. The heavy, pounding rhythm of running boots. A low roar of voices. The church doors burst open again. But this was not one man. It was 10, 20. Miners from the Bitter Creek diggings, their face grimed with dust, their sleeves rolled up, their hands holding pick handles and forge hammers. They flooded the aisles. "What's the trouble? Thaddeus?" one of them yelled. Thaddeus pointed his massive, soot-stained finger at the altar. "The trouble, boys, is that the miners' law has been broken, first in time, first in right. And these men," he jabbed the finger at Pike and Leland, "are claim-jumping thieves." The miners surged forward. A wave of angry, dangerous men. Colton Price's hand flew to his gun. "Stop!" The voice was not Pike's. It was new, cold, and absolute. The crowd in the doorway parted. A tall man in a dark duster and a flat-brimmed hat strode down the aisle. He was not looking at the miners. He was looking at the altar. A silver, 5-pointed star was pinned to his vest. U.S. Marshal Whitcomb. 2 armed deputies followed him, their shotguns held at the ready. "I got a telegram," Whitcomb said, his voice flat, his eyes taking in the scene. The iron safe, the terrified doctor, the forged paper, the angry miners. "Marshal?" Pike sputtered, his face ashen. "Thank God! This is an insurrection! This man, Mercer, and this woman! They have incited a riot!" "It looks to me, Reverend," Whitcomb said, "like you're the one who's been inciting. This became a federal matter when you conspired to defraud a United States mineral claim, and it became a capital matter when you used poison to do it." He held out his hand to Victor Leland. "I'll take that forged document for evidence." Leland, pale and shaking, handed it over. Colton Price saw the entire plan, the entire fortune, dissolving. He was not a man of paper. He was a man of action. He saw the real evidence, the only evidence, in Cassia's hand. With a roar, he lunged, not at the marshal, but at Cassia, his left hand grabbing for the journal. He never touched it. Hale Mercer, unarmed, moved with a speed that was almost invisible. He did not punch Price. He did not go for a weapon. He simply moved inside the man's reach. Hale caught Price's outstretched left wrist with both his hands. He stepped, turned, and used Price's own lunging momentum against him. He dropped his shoulder, put his weight into it, and bent the arm back. There was a single, sickening wet crack that echoed through the silent church. Colton Price screamed. It was a high, thin, reedy sound. All the menace boiled out of him. He crumpled to his knees, clutching his forearm. His left arm hung at an impossible, useless angle. Hale stepped back, breathing hard, his face a mask of cold fury. He placed himself between Price and Cassia in the dead, ringing silence. Abner Pike, the man of iron, collapsed. He fell to his knees at the altar, buried his face in his hands, and began to weep. They were not sounds of grief. They were the dry, racking, horrifying sobs of a man whose soul had just been publicly dissected. "Get him up," Whitcomb ordered his deputies, pointing at the moaning Colton Price. "And him." He nodded to the paralyzed Hiram Keats. "Conspiracy to commit murder. Attempted murder. That's a short rope, gentlemen." As the deputies hauled the two men away, Whitcomb turned to the trembling Victor Leland. "Mr. Leland, you and I are going to have a long talk about railroad development. In a federal cell." The marshal turned to Cassia. He almost smiled. "Miss Wynne, I believe the deadline for your claim is 5 o'clock today. My deputies and I will be happy to escort you to the registrar's office in Sable County. We'll ride right now." The church bell, taken over by a miner, began to ring. A loud, joyous, clanging peal of victory that shook the building. Marshal Whitcomb's voice cut through the stunned, ringing silence of the church. He was not speaking to Pike, who was a broken, weeping heap on the floor, or to the men in his custody. He was speaking to the town. "Let this be known," Whitcomb declared, his voice hard as high desert rock. "The conspiracy to defraud this woman, Cassia Wynne, of her legal, inherited claim, is over." He pointed to the journal on the communion table, beside the iron safe. "This logbook and the assay tags are binding. This is Elijah Wynne's property, and by right of inheritance, it passes to his daughter. The 90-day filing period, which these men sought to exploit, will be honored. My deputies and I will personally escort Miss Wynne to the Sable County Registrar's office today, and I will witness the filing myself. As of this moment, in front of God and this entire town, the claim to Silver Ridge belongs to Cassia Wynne." He motioned to his deputies. "Get these men out of my sight. The rest of you, go home." The deputies dragged the moaning Colton Price, the catatonic Hiram Keats, and the weeping Reverend Pike out into the harsh sunlight. Victor Leland, his face the color of ash, was cuffed and let out last, his era of progress over. The church emptied, not with the usual Sunday chatter, but in a profound, heavy silence. The miners who had come for a fight simply nodded to Thaddeus Crow and melted away. Their point made, "Mrs. Abernathy and Mrs." Prentice scurried out, their faces pale with shame, refusing to look at the woman they had shoved and cast out. Thaddeus Crow caught Hale's eye. He did not smile, but he inclined his massive head, a gesture of profound respect. Nora Bell, standing in the aisle, quietly gathered her coat, a small, victorious smile on her lips. Finally, only two remained. Hale Mercer placed the journal, the tags, and the small wooden marker back into the iron safe. He snapped the lid shut, the sound a definitive, metallic click. He tucked the key into his pocket. He turned to Cassia. She was standing by the altar, her hand resting on the place her father's journal had been. She was breathing, slowly, as if for the first time. Hale held out his hand. She took it. Together, they turned their backs on the empty, desecrated church and walked out into the world. The high desert wind, which had been their enemy, now felt like a clean, scouring hand. It swept the alkali dust of Redwater Crossing from their clothes. The sun, which had been a brutal, burning eye, now felt like a liquid gold benediction, warming their skin. The air, washed clean by the storm, was sharp and new. They rode from the town, Marshal Whitcomb and his deputies falling in behind them, a guard of honor. They did not ride toward the flat, muddy road to Sable County. Not yet. Hale turned Ashbolt's head toward the high country, toward the shepherd's trail, toward the ridges. Cassia, on the mare she had recovered, rode beside him. They rode in silence, the only sound the steady, unhurried plod-clop of the hooves on the damp earth and the jingle of their bridles. They were not running, they were arriving. After an hour, they reached the ridge, Silver Ridge. It was not a dark, foreboding place. In the morning light, the quartz in the rock glittered, a million tiny promises. The wind moved through the high pines, a sound not of moaning, but of breathing. Cassia slid from her saddle. Marshal Whitcomb, understanding, held up his hand, and he and his men stopped 100 yards back, giving them their space. Hale dismounted and stood by Ashbolt, his hand on the horse's neck, watching her. She walked, her boots sinking into the rich earth, until she reached the small, simple pile of stones her father had erected. The first marker, his marker. She placed her hand on the flat. Sun-warmed granite. This was not a grave. It was a foundation. Her father, Elijah Wynne, had poured his life into this rock, and these men had tried to turn it into a tombstone. But she had survived. She had taken his name back, and now it was a milestone. She stood there for a long time, her back to Hale, her shoulders straight. The wind whipped her pale hair across her face, but she did not brush it away. No tears fell. Her time for weeping was over. A slow, sure smile, a smile of profound, exhausted, and absolute ownership, touched her lips. Hale walked toward her, his boots making no sound on the soft pine needles. He stopped just behind her. He, too, looked out over the vast expanse of the territory, a land of harsh beauty and unforgiving law. He had come to this place to be alone, to build a wall against the world that had taken everything. And now, the world, in its most fragile and ferocious form, was standing right in front of him. He reached out. He did not touch her shoulder. His hand, calloused and sure, moved to her throat. He gently, his fingers grazing her skin, touched the edge of her father's scarf near her collarbone. She did not flinch. She leaned her head back, a small, trusting gesture that rested her hair against his chest. He spoke, his voice low, a gravelly question meant only for her and the wind. "Do you want," he asked, his throat tight, "the porch at Juniper Wash to be your home?" It was everything. It was not a question of love. It was a question of timber and nails and a shared roof against the storm. It was a question of a future. Cassia did not answer with words. She turned in his arms, her movement fluid and certain. She pressed her face against his chest, her hands coming up to grip the front of his shirt. She wrapped her arms around him, holding on, not as a drowning woman, but as a woman who had found her anchor. She felt it, beneath her ear, the steady, solid, living thud-thud of his heart, the sound that had become her truth. It was the only answer she needed to give. It was the only answer he needed to hear. He held her, his own arms crushing her to him, his face buried in her wind-tangled hair. He breathed in the scent of her, sage and rain and iron. She tilted her head back, her gray eyes, clear and bright, finding his. He lowered his head. He kissed her. There was no chase. There was no desperation. There was no cold. This kiss was slow, and it was deep. It was the taste of sunlight on stone, of pine resin, and the promise of cornbread in a warm cabin. It was a kiss of arrival. It was a vow, made in the open air, under a high, clean sky. It was a promise, sealed with a shared breath, that from this day forward, neither of them would ever be the one to collapse, alone, on the steps of a church, far below. In the valley, a new sound echoed, the steady, rhythmic clang of a hammer on an anvil. Thaddeus Crow was at his forge, beating new iron, setting a new pace for a town that would have to relearn what was right. Miles away, at the schoolhouse, Nora Bell carefully folded the copy of the telegram she had sent. She placed it in her desk drawer, a small smile touching her lips. Justice had been taught. The curtain falls on a small, dusty room in the Sable County Courthouse. Hours later, a hand, a clerk's hand, ink-stained and indifferent to the drama, opens a heavy ledger. He takes the geological journal, the assay tags, and the declaration, all witnessed by a U.S. Marshal. He takes the heavy, wooden-handled stamp, he presses it onto the red ink pad, and he brings it down. Thud. The sound is final, a sound of irrefutable, permanent justice. The camera closes on the paper, the red ink blooming indelibly. Next to the seal of Elia Wynne, registered, Sable County, Cassia Wynne, and in the distance, from the town they left, the church bell rings. Not in warning, not in judgment, but in a clear, sharp, final note of truth. Thank you for listening to this story. We would love to know where in the world you are listening from, so please leave us a comment below to connect and share your thoughts. Be sure to subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850 like this video, and give us extra support by hitting that hype button to help this story be heard by more people.